Okay, it's getting late in the day over here. I wanted to at least start talking about Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is practicing legally and ethically. There's a lot of buttons to be pushed in this chapter, and I have quite a number of comments I want you to keep in mind as you read. Starting on page 70, I think they make an interesting point about the difference between morals and ethics. And while they don't say this, one thing to keep in mind is that since morals are based partly on your religious background, which they do say, it says professional decisions may or may not agree with practitioners' morals. Rather, practitioners are required to comply with professional ethics and legal mandates. So we may have disagreements about morals because of our upbringing and our religious background, among many other things. But when it talks about ethics, it says ethics guide how a person behaves and makes decisions, and those are professional decisions. And they are enforced through regulatory boards primarily. Although you can file an ethics complaint with AOTA, they really have no enforcement arm. I'll talk about that in a second. So you may have disagreements about morals. There can be no disagreement about ethics. As an OT, you follow and practice according to the OT Code of Ethics. And this is not a matter of opinions. This is not black and white, but it is something that we all agree to uphold. So, unlike morals, there can be no disagreements about what's ethical and what's not, although there's some difficult ethical dilemmas. Then it says a little later on page 70, laws are intended to protect citizens from unsafe practices, whereas ethics compel the professional to provide the highest level of care, according to ethical standards. So again, they make some great distinctions between morals, ethics, and laws. And of course, we know how laws are enforced. We know morals are rarely enforced. And I'm telling you that ethics are enforced by ethical boards. So in the state of Colorado, we have a licensure board. If I observe or are involved in some unethical practice, I should be reported to the regulatory board for Colorado. Let's see. There's a mention on page 70 about the Code of Ethics being an Appendix A. There's a great Appendix A in this book, but it's not the Code of Ethics. So apparently it was a change that was made in the book, and they decided instead to include it in the body of Chapter 8. And there's a really good section, multiple sections, 6 to be exact, in Chapter 8, that run through the Code of Ethics. Very much valuable reading, and you'll find it useful in responding to the ethics discussion board, which is now open. Okay, so in Principle 1, Beneficence, the little case study there says Mr. Parker can no longer pay for OT services. His occupational therapist, Karen, started a daily self-feeding program for Mr. Parker before his funds ran out. Karen visits Mr. Parker at mealtime and explains the proper use of adaptive equipment, implying that even though he can't pay anymore, he's still getting some OT services. I think what Karen, the OT, worked out is workable, but this little paragraph implies that there is freedom in a structured setting like a skilled nursing facility or inpatient rehab to continue treating someone when they no longer have a way to pay and they become private pay. It's just not true anymore. people are held to 85 and 87% productivity standards, meaning that they have to bill for the majority of time they see people. And if you're seeing someone who has no way to pay, there's no way to bill. And so the time with that person would be severely restricted, and you'd have to be pretty creative and maybe doing some time on your own time off the clock, which is not a bad idea. It's just that I don't want anyone to believe that when people lose their way to pay because they run through their insurance, that they'll continue to get treatment no problem, because that's definitely not the way it is. Okay, there's another little scenario about Tanya, a 15-year-old teen, and you can read it. It's on page 71 in the left-hand column. I just want to bring up that the story goes that the therapist brought up a problem in group the next day, and that would really go against ethical principle 3, autonomy and confidentiality. It would have been better for that OT to bring that up in private with that client. I think you'll see what I mean when you read it. On page 71, right-hand column, talking about the principle autonomy, it says number 4, respect the client's decision to refuse treatment. I think it's important to clarify there that in the real world, people are only allowed to stay in rehab if they are getting all therapies for the time of day that is required by that facility. Therapists often speak of problems when a person continually refuses therapy, because in reality, if they refuse too many treatments, and it's not many, they cannot stay as inpatients in that facility. So what was actually worked out, it's described in the book under Principle 3, Autonomy, is a great, great plan. I'm sorry, we're still talking about Principle 2 with Tanya. So I think we'll see this the good plan I'm talking about comes up a little later in the chapter. Okay, so autonomy and the number 4, respect the client's decision to refuse treatment. If you go to Mrs. Jones in that section, still on page 71, you'll see what I'm talking about, the plan that they worked out in the case that OT essentially was being refused, and they found a way to get this client to see the value and to deal with the problem that was causing her to refuse treatment. So on to page 72. Let's see. There's a little vignette on the left-hand column at the bottom of page 72, and it talks about Caitlin, an OTA, moves to a new site and requests a copy of the Licensure Act or law. Well, this is exactly what you should do when you change states. You need to read their licensure law and make sure you are within your scope of practice. So, for example, if you move from a state like Colorado that allows OTs to use physical agent modalities like ultrasound to a state that doesn't allow OTs, it's not within their practice act, you have to realize that you're on thin ice to continue to use that modality, even if you understood how to use it correctly in your original state. And so you face an ethical challenge and even a legal challenge if you are performing what they would call outside your scope of practice. Okay, let's see. Okay, there's an interesting section called Solving Ethical Problems. They don't ever really talk about ethical dilemmas, which is what every other profession talks about. One of the things it says on page 73, the section starts on page 72, is determine the ethical principles involved, for example, beneficence, non-maleficence, also the sub-principles involved, because what you're trying to decipher is, in a true ethical dilemma, you're trying to uphold one ethical standard, and in the process you end up not upholding another one. And you have to figure out which one is more important in that certain situation. So this is getting long. I'm going to cut it off and do it in 2 parts for this chapter.